before we ride into today's story. Go ahead and like the video, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from viewers all across the country. The air was thick with the dust of the day's heat, the kind of heat that weighed heavy on your skin and made even the hardest of men sweat. In the center of town, the mercantile stood as a silent witness to the comings and goings of daily life. But today was different. Today, the quiet was shattered by the sound of boots pounding the boards. A woman stumbled out of the store's doorway, her arm clutching the spot where a man had shoved her, sending her sprawling into the dirt. She stood there for a moment, as though frozen, a mark of shame painted across her face. The townsfolk watched from every corner of the street, their eyes trained on her, their whispers already starting to build. The storekeeper had shouted after her, accusing her of theft, of taking what didn't belong to her. The town, always quick to judge, had already decided what kind of woman she was. They didn't need to ask any questions. They already knew, but she knew the truth. Her name was Sarah, once a married woman, now a widow. She had come west to start over, to leave the ghosts of her past behind. But instead of finding peace, she had found gossip, and as her knees wobbled beneath her, the weight of the world seemed to press down harder. The street was still tense, waiting for the next move. Across the street, a cowboy stood leaning against a hitching rail, eyes narrowed under the brim of his hat. He had seen his fair share of this. The whispers, the judgment, the way the innocent became the guilty in the blink of an eye. He didn't know her, but something about the way she stood there, broken but proud, caught his attention. Luke, a drifter, a man whose name meant little to most, whose past was only spoken of in hushed tones. He had walked away from too many towns to count, leaving behind only a trail of blood and bad memories. But today, in this town, something was different. He wasn't going to walk away. Not this time. He stepped forward slowly, his spurs echoing in the silence as he approached the woman. The crowd watched, waiting for him to speak, to make the next move. But he didn't speak. He didn't need to. He bent down and picked up the sack of flowers she had dropped, tossing a coin onto the ground. "Paid," he said flatly, the word cutting to the tension in the air. The crowd murmured, shifting uneasily, but no one dared to challenge him. No one dared to speak. They knew better than that. Sarah's eyes flickered to the coin, then back to him. She wanted to ask why. Why would he risk this for her, when no one else would? But the words caught in her throat. She couldn't speak. Luke stood up, brushing the dust off his hands, and turned to leave. But something in the woman's silence, in the way she held herself together despite the weight of the world pressing down on her, stopped him. He didn't know her story. He didn't know why she was here, or what had brought her to this place. But he knew one thing. She was alone. And in this town, that meant something. The sun had begun to dip low behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty street. Sarah walked slowly back to her shack, her shoulders stiff, her hands still trembling from the weight of the sack she carried. The murmurs of the townsfolk followed her, their eyes lingering on her like shadows she couldn't outrun. It had been the same since she arrived, a woman with no past, no future, only whispers that chased her wherever she went. As Sarah passed the porch of her tiny shack at the edge of town, she caught a glimpse of the night sky, deepening into a starless void. The night was closing in, and with it came the eerie silence that always followed moments like these, moments where the crowd's judgment was final. She stopped, just for a second, and leaned against the doorframe of her shack. The sack of flour, now a reminder of her struggle, slipped from her shoulders. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, letting the cool evening air fill her lungs. Behind her, she heard the soft creak of the livery door as it swung open, a familiar sound, the rhythmic clop of hooves on dirt, followed by the familiar crunch of boots on gravel. It was Luke. His presence had become a constant in the last few hours, and though she had refused to acknowledge it, she couldn't deny that she had noticed. He had chosen to stay when he didn't have to. Luke watched from a distance as Sarah struggled with the sack of flour, the weariness in her movements striking him. He had been a drifter for far too long, walking from one town to the next, never staying long enough to care. His hands, once used to violence, now longed for a simpler life, a life that had slipped through his fingers like the wind. But here in this town, in this moment, there was something more, something deeper. He couldn't explain it. He wasn't a hero, nor was he a man of virtue. But there was a pain in Sarah's eyes, a loneliness, that called him in a way nothing else had before. He hadn't asked for this, but he wasn't going to leave her to face it alone. The next morning, Luke stood outside the livery, leaning against the hitching rail, watching the sunrise. His mind was far from the warmth of the sun. It was with Sarah. He knew that staying was risky. The town would talk. They would whisper, accuse, and maybe worse. But what choice did he have? He had seen her at the mercantile yesterday, the way her fingers tightened around a sack of flour, the way she walked away, head high despite the shame that clung to her like a second skin. She was broken, but she was strong. It wasn't a strength born from pride or defiance. It was a strength born from survival. As the day unfolded, Sarah kept to herself. She worked quietly in her shack, washing clothes, mending a small tear in her dress, trying to ignore the gnawing hunger that had taken hold of her since yesterday. She hadn't eaten since the morning. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it. She had learned to ignore hunger, to push it down with the steady rhythm of work. But the exhaustion was starting to show, and she could feel the weight of it pulling at her every step. She heard footsteps outside, heavy boots crunching the gravel. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Luke. He stood at the threshold, his hat pulled low, the shadow of his past hanging behind him like a cloak. "I brought you something," Luke said, his voice steady, but there was an underlying softness to it that she hadn't heard before. He stepped inside, holding out a strip of dried meat and a tin cup. Sarah hesitated, but the hunger inside her was too much to ignore. She reached out and took the meat, her fingers trembling slightly. She hated needing help, hated that it came from someone she didn't know, someone who had no reason to care for her. Luke noticed the hesitation in her eyes, but he said nothing. He just stood there, watching her eat. He knew the town was watching. He knew they were already starting to gossip about Sarah and him, about the strange bond they shared. But none of that mattered. Not anymore. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly after a moment, swallowing the last of the meat. She glanced at him, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of something more than gratitude. She had tried to ignore it, to push it down, but it was there. It had always been there. Luke didn't reply at first. Instead, he moved to the window, looking out into the street. His mind wandered back to the moment in the mercantile, the way the storekeeper had shouted at Sarah, the way the townsfolk had stood back, waiting for her to be crushed under the weight of their judgment. He wasn't sure why he had stepped in. Maybe it was because he couldn't stand to watch someone get treated like that. Maybe it was because he had been on the other side of that cruelty too many times before. But there was something about Sarah, a quiet strength he couldn't ignore. He turned back to her, his voice low. "The roof won't hold when the rains come. I'll fix it." Sarah blinked, looking up at him. She wanted to argue, to tell him she didn't need his charity. But the truth was, she didn't have a choice. She sighed, her shoulders sagging with the weight of everything she had been carrying. "Why?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "Because I can," Luke replied simply, his eyes meeting hers. "Because it needs doing." She stared at him for a long moment. Her pride warred with the exhaustion in her bones, but she didn't argue. Instead, she stepped back, allowing him to leave without saying another word. Later that evening, as the sun began to set and the shadows grew longer, Luke returned. He had a small sack of nails in his hand and a hammer from the blacksmith shop. He didn't say a word as he climbed the roof, his movements steady, confident, as he began to work. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching him. She didn't know why he was doing this. She didn't know what he saw in her, what made him decide to stay when everything in him should have told him to leave. But she couldn't deny the relief that settled in her chest as she watched him work. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe. The next few days passed slowly. The wind carried a heavy silence across the town, as if even nature was holding its breath. Sarah and Luke kept their distance, yet both knew they were no longer strangers. There was something unspoken between them, something that weighed on both their shoulders like the dust that hung in the air. Luke's presence had become a fixture in Sarah's life. It wasn't just the repairs he made to her roof or the small jobs he did around the town. He was there, quietly watching, quietly protecting. She couldn't ignore him, not anymore. And perhaps, for the first time in a long while, she didn't want to. The townspeople, however, weren't so subtle. Whispers followed Sarah wherever she went, and she could feel their eyes burning into her back when she stepped out into the street. Every glance, every sideways look, was a reminder that she was an outsider in this place. Even if she had tried to make a life here, it had been tainted by the rumors. No one would ever see her for who she truly was. But Luke had no such ties to this town. He was a drifter, a man without a past, and therefore without a future. He didn't belong to anyone or anything. And yet, he had chosen to stand beside her, even as the town closed in. Her heart ached with a quiet gratitude she couldn't quite voice. Yet at the same time, it was a dangerous feeling, because it was fragile. One afternoon, Sarah found herself standing at the pump, filling a bucket with water, when a voice broke through the air. "Looks like the drifter is taking a liking to you, Sarah." It was Marla, the storekeeper's wife, her voice thick with disdain. Sarah's jaw tightened. She could feel the others' eyes on her, men leaning against the porch, women sitting on their stoops, all watching, waiting for her to respond. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said coldly, her hand steady as she continued to fill the bucket. But even as she said it, she could feel the weight of her own silence pressing in on her. The truth was, she didn't know what they were talking about. Luke had been seen helping her with repairs, walking beside her in town, and those whispers, they were growing sharper by the day. Marla snorted, a bitter laugh escaping her. "Don't act like you don't know what's going on. A woman like you, with all the baggage you've got, shouldn't be leaning on someone like him." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The last thing she wanted to do was get into a shouting match with someone who already had a story to tell. She pulled the bucket away from the pump and turned to leave, but not before Marla's words dug deeper. "Mark my words, Sarah," Marla called out. "A drifter's loyalty comes a price, and you won't want to pay it." Sarah's hands clenched around the bucket, her knuckles turning white. She kept walking, ignoring the mocking laughter that followed her every step. But as Sarah approached the door to her shack, she felt a familiar presence close behind her. Luke. He hadn't said a word when he saw her at the pump, nor did he intervene in any way. But there he was, standing at the threshold of the door, his dark eyes filled with something unreadable. She stopped in her tracks. The words Marla had said burned in her mind. Was she right? Did Luke's loyalty come with strings attached? Was she just another mark in a drifter's game? "Are you all right?" Luke's voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like a blade. Sarah didn't know how to respond. She didn't want to appear weak. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing just how much those words had affected her. "Just tired," she said, though the truth was anything but. Luke didn't push. Instead, he stepped inside, his boots heavy on the wooden floorboards, his gaze flicking toward the stove, where Sarah had been trying to cook a meager meal for herself. "I'll go into town tomorrow," he said, his voice low, steady. "Find some work." Sarah didn't want to be reminded of their circumstances. She didn't want to feel the weight of his help, his generosity. But there was something in his eyes that made it hard to push him away, even if she tried. "I don't need your charity," she said, the words coming out harsher than she intended. Luke's gaze flicked toward her, then back to the window, where the sunlight was slowly beginning to fade into dusk. "I'm not giving you charity, Sarah," he replied, simply, his tone steady. "I'm giving you something else. Something you've earned." She didn't understand what he meant. She didn't want to understand. The weight of his words lingered in the room, heavy and uncomfortable. Before she could say anything else, Luke walked to the door, grabbed his hat, and left. That night, the storm began to roll in, slow at first, then faster, until the wind howled through the trees and the thunder rattled the walls of her shack. Inside, Sarah sat at the table, staring at the dim light of the candle as the wind beat against the walls. Her mind raced with all the thoughts she had been avoiding, the doubts, the questions, the fear. Fear that she had allowed herself to depend on Luke. Fear that she had allowed herself to believe in the fragile connection that had been slowly building between them. But the storm outside wasn't the only thing keeping her awake. She kept thinking about Marla's words, about what it meant to stand by a man like Luke. She didn't want to need him. She didn't want to rely on anyone, especially a drifter who had no place to call home. And yet, there was a part of her, buried deep down, that didn't want to let go. A part of her that wanted to trust, to believe that for once, someone could be trusted. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of hammering outside her door. The storm had passed, but the tension that followed was still thick in the air. She opened the door and saw Luke working on her roof once again, his hands steady as he repaired the damage from the night before. He didn't look up when she stepped outside. He didn't need to. Sarah watched him, the silence between them hanging heavy. For the first time, she realized she wasn't angry anymore. Not with him, not with herself. She stepped forward, walked to the edge of the porch, and stopped. Her heart was heavy with everything she had been carrying. The burden of the rumors, the weight of the past. But there was something different now. Something she couldn't ignore. The quiet tension in town grew thicker with each passing day. The storm had washed the streets clean, but the lingering whispers and the burden of truth weighed heavily on both Sarah and Luke. The townsfolk's suspicions only seemed to grow with every repair Luke made to Sarah's shack, with every moment he stayed. The day after the storm passed, the air felt thick with impending change, a heavy silence hanging over the town. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break, something she had no control over. It came without warning. 2 riders appeared on the outskirts of town, their horses kicking up dust as they made their way toward the center. The entire town seemed to hold its breath, the workers pausing, children scurrying inside, the saloon quiet for the first time in ages. Luke had been preparing his horse when he saw them, riders he knew all too well. His hands clenched around the reins, his jaw tightening. They had found him. The riders didn't even need to say a word to make their presence known. Their clothes were cleaner than the average townsperson, their boots polished and their eyes sharp. The town wasn't large enough to hide such men, and Sarah had noticed them before they noticed her. Their faces were as familiar as the shadows of Luke's past, a past he'd been trying to outrun for years. Luke didn't move, his eyes cold and focused, but Sarah could feel the weight of it, the knowing, the reason Luke had been keeping his distance, the reason he had been so careful not to get too close. They were here for him. The tall rider, whose eyes seemed to pierce right through Luke, spoke first. "Been looking for you," the man said, his voice low, but carrying. "Long way, too. You owe for what happened down by the border. Men don't forget debts." Luke didn't flinch. His voice was quiet, but heavy with years of regret. "What debt?" he asked, his hands resting lightly on his gun. "The kind that can't be paid with coins," the rider replied, his smirk twisted. "The kind you pay standing up or lying down." The crowd gathered behind them, eyes wide with anticipation, but no one dared to move. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped into the street, her voice shaky but resolute. "What is this about, Luke?" she called out, her gaze meeting his, searching for answers. Luke's eyes flicked to her for a brief moment, then back to the riders. He didn't want to drag her into this. He didn't want to drag anyone into his past. But the truth was, they had already made her a part of it. The questions in her eyes spoke volumes, and he knew, deep down, he couldn't keep running forever. "Don't make her a part of this, Luke," the tall rider spat. "You think you can hide behind her?" Sarah stood tall, her eyes narrowing. "If you're going to threaten him, you'll have to go through me." The rider laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You don't even know what you're standing up for, woman. He's a coward, hides behind his gun, and a woman he doesn't even care about." The word stung, but Sarah's defiance didn't falter. "I know exactly what I'm standing up for." The crowd, sensing the rising tension, edged back, unsure what would come next. Luke's face hardened as he stepped forward, his body tense, ready for whatever came next. "If you want me, come get me," Luke said, his voice cutting to the thick air like a knife. The tall rider's smirk faltered for a moment, and the second rider shifted in his saddle, hand resting on the butt of his gun. There was no more talk, only action. The first rider made a move toward Luke, a flash of steel catching the sun. Everything slowed down. Luke was faster. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the street, a sharp crack that seemed to freeze time for a moment. The rider's hand, once reaching for his holstered weapon, jerked back, blood staining his sleeve. Luke's gun was back in its holster before the dust had even settled, his stance calm and controlled, though his heart pounded in his chest. "You should have stayed away," Luke said, his voice low but final. The tall rider staggered back, his hand clutching his arm, shock on his face. He looked to his companion, who was now glaring at Sarah, his expression furious. "Get up, let's go," the rider growled to his injured companion. He turned to Luke one last time, his eyes filled with rage. "We're not done here, drifter," the rider spat, his words heavy with threat. Before anyone could move, the two riders turned their horses and rode off, disappearing into the distance, leaving the town in stunned silence. Luke stood still for a moment, his hand still resting on his holstered gun, his face unreadable. Sarah stepped closer, her breath shallow. "That's it then," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "They won't be coming back?" Luke didn't respond immediately. His eyes scanned the horizon, looking for something that wasn't there, before finally turning to her. "No," he said, his voice heavy. "They won't." The storm had passed, but the damage had been done. The entire town watched as Sarah and Luke walked back toward her shack. The whisper started again, but they were different this time. The truth was out in the open now. Luke wasn't just a drifter. He had a past. He had enemies. And Sarah? She was no longer the town's scapegoat. The crowd had seen her stand up, seen her defend Luke, and that had made all the difference. They didn't speak much that night. The tension between them was thick, but it wasn't just because of the confrontation. Something had shifted between them, a fragile, unspoken understanding. They were no longer just two people thrown together by circumstance. They were a team. The next few days were quiet. Luke continued to work on repairs around the town, fixing fences, hauling supplies, and generally making himself useful. The people of the town, while still wary, had started to soften toward him. He wasn't a stranger anymore. He was part of their community, whether they liked it or not. Sarah, for a part, had found herself returning to a normal rhythm. She didn't have to look over her shoulder every time she stepped out of the house. She didn't have to worry about the rumors, at least not as much. It wasn't perfect. The whispers still followed her, but they were quieter now. The people who had once turned their backs on her were beginning to see her for who she truly was. A woman who had survived in a town that didn't want her. And as for Luke, Sarah had come to realize that he wasn't just some drifter passing through. He was a man who had chosen to stay, to fight for something. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. One evening, after a long day of work, Sarah and Luke found themselves alone, sitting on her porch. The night air was cool, and the first stars had begun to appear in the sky. Neither of them spoke for a while. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was a kind of silence that existed between two people who had come to understand each other, without the need for words. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "Why did you stay?" she asked, her voice soft, though there was a hint of vulnerability in it. Luke looked at her, his expression hard to read. "Because I've spent my life running," he said quietly. "And I'm tired. Tired of leaving people behind. Tired of running from my own past." The truth hung between them, raw and unspoken. Sarah didn't know how to respond. There was so much she wanted to say, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she reached out, resting her hand on his. "I'm glad you stayed," she said simply. Luke turned to look at her, his hand brushing against hers, his fingers lightly tracing the outline of her palm. The touch was brief, but it said everything they couldn't say out loud. The town, once cold and indifferent, had begun to warm up to the two of them. Sarah and Luke were no longer the town's outcasts. They had built something here, together, and maybe, just maybe, they had built something that was more than survival, something worth fighting for. The story of Sarah and Luke was no longer one of fear and isolation. It was a story of trust, of vulnerability, and of two people who had once been lost but had found something real, something that had the potential to last, despite the scars of the past. No longer bound by the whispers, no longer shackled by the judgments of others, they had finally found a home, not in the town, but in each other. And as they sat together that night, side by side, the wind gently rustling the trees, they both knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The town, for all its faults, had become a place of hope, and so had they.